June 15th, 2021. A warm summer afternoon in rural Tennessee. 5-year-old Summer Wells is seen planting flowers with her mother and grandmother. Within moments, she vanishes. No screams, no witnesses, no trace. What followed was a nationwide search that turned into a labyrinth of rumors, contradictions, and false hope. And at the center of it all was a mother whose story just never seemed to sit right. Candus Wells gave multiple accounts of what happened that day. She claimed Summer walked back into the house, went downstairs to play with her toys, and simply disappeared. But the timeline shifts each time she speaks. First it was 2 minutes, then it was 5. Some interviews show her calm, almost detached, while others show rehearsed emotion that fades as quickly as it appeared. As the days turned into years, the public started asking a chilling question: was her confession really the truth? Tonight, we're not just revisiting the disappearance. We're dissecting the mother's narrative, line by line, contradiction by contradiction. Because beneath the surface of her words lies something darker: inconsistencies, misquotes, and a confession that feels less like truth and more like a carefully constructed story. And if that's the case, then the question becomes, what is she hiding? This is not a stray theory or internet rumor. This is a structured look at how her own words crumble under scrutiny. From the emotional flatline to the impossible timeline, from the YouTube interview clips to her changing version of events, we are asking the hard question out loud. Is Candus Wells lying about what really happened to her daughter? And if she is, then maybe the truth about what happened to Summer Wells has been closer all along, hidden inside a story that was never meant to be believed. If you're here to get closer to the truth, stay with me. If you are here for justice, please stay back and watch. Because after hearing what this man claims, you may never look at this case the same again. These are not just holes in an investigation, they are cracks where the truth could be hiding. Because children don't just disappear without someone, somewhere, knowing what happened. And in this case, the silence is almost as disturbing as the disappearance itself. But before we dive into this, kindly subscribe to our channel if you believe in fighting for justice. We've just crossed 4,000 subscribers, all because of your support, and we need that same energy to reach 5,000, then 6,000, and then 10,000. So go ahead and drop your fingerprints on that subscribe button and where you watching from. Because wherever you are, the day this vision is fulfilled, I will send my appreciation straight to you. Let's keep building this community that fights for justice together. Today we unravel the troubling inconsistencies in Candus Wells' statements. Pieces that suggest her confession may be misleading, if not outright deceptive. On June 15, 2021, the Wells family claimed their 5-year-old daughter, Summer Moon Utah Wells, disappeared from their rural home in Rogersville, Tennessee. They say 1 minute she was helping plant flowers, and the next, she was gone. Law enforcement launched one of the most extensive searches in state history. Media flooded the story. The public rallied around the missing child, expecting a frantic and grieving mother to lead the charge for answers. But instead, what we got was something else entirely. From the very beginning, Candus Wells' account has been the center of the narrative, and yet it has shifted repeatedly. First, she said Summer went inside the house to play, then that she walked over to the basement, then that she was outside playing with her brothers. The timeline shrinks and expands, the details blur, and her emotional response feels strange, sometimes blank, sometimes overly controlled. And as more interviews surfaced, the public began to notice that key parts of her story simply didn't add up. So tonight, we're not just revisiting the disappearance, we're analyzing the mother's testimony, word by word, minute by minute, to expose the cracks. Because when a parent is supposed to be the eyewitness to their own child's disappearance, and even their own confession begins to fragment under basic scrutiny, we have to ask ourselves, is this confusion or a carefully crafted lie? This is Detective Max. And if you made it this far, it means you don't just watch true crime, you believe in justice. If you're ready to stand until the truth is exposed, if you believe that no lie should go unchallenged, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because on this channel, we don't stop until every stone is turned, every contradiction exposed, and every guilty heart brought to light. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has reached. How many people around the world are willing to sacrifice their time, their energy, their voice, just to make sure justice prevails for the innocent? Candus claimed that Summer was out of her sight for just a few minutes, a small window of time where everything supposedly went wrong. She described sending Summer inside to play while she finished up outside. She says she followed shortly after, called out, and suddenly realized her daughter was gone. But the more you listen to her recount that day, the more those few minutes feel elastic. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 5. In some interviews she mentions calling Summer right away. In others she admits she continued working outside before checking on her. Let's ask a simple question. How does a catastrophic disappearance happen in a matter of minutes, in broad daylight, in a home surrounded by family members? And more importantly, why does Candus keep changing how long Summer was alone? If it were truly just a moment, wouldn't that be etched into her memory with painful precision? Renee Ellery, an experienced behavioral analyst, pointed out how unnervingly calm both Candus and Don Wells appeared, almost eerily unaffected, rather than frantic. She questioned how two parents could describe their child vanishing in minutes, and yet display such restrained emotion, nearly detached from urgency. This disconnect raises one of the first red flags. If the timeline is already inconsistent, and the emotional tone doesn't reflect the severity of the situation, then what else about this confessions has been carefully smoothed over or re-edited for public consumption? What truly unsettles many people about this case isn't just what Candus Wells says, but how she says it. Over several interviews, both televised and online, her demeanor remains strangely flat. Her face shows minimal distress. Her voice rarely breaks. There's a calmness, almost a mechanical quality, as if she's reciting information rather than reliving a traumatic memory. One would expect a mother of a missing 5-year-old to appear frantic, shattered, desperate for answers. Instead, Candus appears subdued, even detached, as if the gravity of what happened never fully registers on her face. Professionals who specialize in behavioral cues often point to a particular kind of emotional mismatch, when the emotional tone does not align with the claimed experience. In situations involving a missing child, genuine panic is usually unfiltered. Parents stumble through words, emotions spill over uncontrollably, even on camera. They interrupt themselves, they plead, they lose composure. But in the Wells interviews, what we see is a contained, muted presentation, a calmness that doesn't grow or intensify, even when she describes the moment she discovers her daughter is gone. Some defenders say, people grieve differently, and that's absolutely true. Trauma can manifest in silence or detachment. But here's where things turn. This emotional flatline persists across multiple appearances, filmed at different times, in different settings, months apart, yet the tone barely changes. No emotional arc, no escalation or visible deterioration, despite the passing of time and growing public scrutiny. That level of consistent emotional neutrality leads many to wonder if this is less about shock and more about control. Because when someone rehearses a story over and over, they often cling to one emotional register, afraid to deviate from it. That's why investigators, and thousands of viewers online, have raised the same question. Is Candus emotionally detached because of trauma, or is she detached because she's keeping her story carefully scripted? And if that calm is actually control, what exactly is she trying so hard to keep under control? Now let's focus on where this allegedly happened, the Wells family home in Beech Creek. Remote, elevated, a heavily wooded property set deep in rural Tennessee, surrounded by hills, a narrow driveway, and thick forest. It's not a place where strangers just wander by. In fact, several law enforcement officers have publicly stated that for someone to abduct a child from that property, they'd likely need prior knowledge of the home's layout, the family's routine, and a good escape route. That alone makes the idea of a random stranger kidnapping Summer in broad daylight, within minutes, extremely difficult to accept. Candus claims she was only steps away, outside working on planting flowers, while Summer supposedly walked inside the house, then downstairs. One adult, 3 boys, and the family dogs were all reportedly nearby. So how does a child vanish in silence under those conditions, without anyone noticing movement, sound, or struggle? Why weren't the dogs barking? Why didn't any of the boys see or hear anything? Even more puzzling, if someone really approached the house unnoticed, got inside or around the property, grabbed Summer, and escaped, all in a handful of minutes that would require near military precision. This is why many people believe that the environment itself undermines Candus's version of events. The setting is too secluded for a casual intruder and too chaotic, with multiple people present, for a clean, silent abduction. It starts to look less like a random disappearance and more like something that may have happened right under the roof, something that needed a story, not a witness. Simply put, the geography and logistics of that home make Candus's confession not only inconsistent, but highly implausible. And when the surroundings contradict the story, we have to question not just where Summer went, but whether the story was ever meant to be believable from the start. As investigators and the public began reviewing Candus Wells' statements, a pattern emerged, not just confusion, but contradiction. In one interview, Candus says she walked Summer into the house and told her to go downstairs to play. In another clip, she claims Summer just ran off inside, while she stayed outside, finishing chores. In a separate conversation, she hints that the boys saw Summer go downstairs, but in another she says they didn't see her at all. These inconsistencies aren't minor. They change the fundamental timeline of the last moment Summer was seen. When a story is truthful, even under stress, the core details stay consistent. The times may blur, but the sequence of events remains the same. Yet Candus's description of that day morphs, depending on who is asking, how the question is phrased, or how much pressure she appears to feel. Sometimes she claims she searched the house herself. Other times she says she assumed Summer was outside. Each version subtly shifts responsibility, as if she's constantly adjusting the narrative for safety. Investigators often note that shifting stories can signal fabrication, not because someone forgot, but because they never really experienced the event the way they claimed. When the basic structure of the confession changes, it's not just memory failing, it's truth bending. And in this case, those contradictions became glaring enough that even casual viewers noticed. You don't need law enforcement training to recognize when someone keeps editing their own script. These conflicting details force us to reevaluate the credibility of Candus's entire account. If the timeline can never stay the same, and if the story keeps evolving, then how much of her so-called confession is actually real, and how much of it has been slowly manufactured to protect herself, or someone else? As Candus continued to appear in interviews and brief clips online, the public turned to social media to dissect every word, every gesture, and every inconsistency. Reddit threads exploded with theories. YouTube channels began analyzing footage frame by frame. Some comments were emotional, others deeply analytical, but one recurring theme kept appearing: she's not telling the full truth. One user wrote, "It's like she's trying to remember a version of events, not recalling them." Another wrote, "I do believe Candus is lying about how much time passed between sending Summer inside and realizing she was gone." These were everyday viewers, not experts, but collectively, they started identifying patterns that law enforcement would normally keep confidential: the shifting story, the calm tone, the lack of urgency, the missing details. Social media may not be a courtroom, but it has become a public archive of evidence and collective intuition. Thousands of people, watching from different angles, ended up noticing the same red flags. That many voices arriving at the same concern can't be ignored, especially in a case with so little closure. And when the supposed confession from the mother keeps changing, the public scrutiny intensifies. People began asking harder questions. If it really happened in minutes, why can't she keep the timeline straight? If a stranger took Summer, how did they slip past dogs, brothers, and daylight? And if Candus is innocent, why does every version of her story create more confusion, instead of clarity? In the court of public opinion, her credibility is rapidly eroding, and sometimes that erosion happens for a reason. At this stage, even behavioral experts began to weigh in. Professionals trained in deception detection observed not just what Candus was saying, but how she presented herself while saying it. Analysts like Renee Ellery and others who specialize in micro-expression study noted the lack of emotional congruence, the way her facial expressions didn't match the gravity of her words. Statements delivered without visible distress. No involuntary reactions. Nothing slipping through the cracks. Experts often explain that real grief or trauma creates leakage. The body betrays pain even when someone tries to stay calm. You see trembling hands, darting eyes, broken voice, the kinds of raw reactions that are nearly impossible to fake consistently. But Candus's interviews, spread across months, remain strangely uniform, calm, detached, at times even rehearsed. That kind of sustained control is often associated with someone who is managing their narrative carefully, not reliving a traumatic memory. Historically, we've seen similar cases where early interviews seemed composed, until later inconsistencies and body language exposed lies. Experts have compared this behavior to known examples of false confession or manipulated testimony, where individuals altered details repeatedly, showing emotional restraint to avoid exposing deeper truth. And while none of this proves guilt on its own, it builds a psychological profile of someone who may be withholding critical information. When trained eyes start pointing to deception cues, rehearsed tone, controlled breathing, avoidance of concrete detail, it becomes harder to dismiss these interviews as innocent or simply awkward. It suggests calculation. And in the context of the missing child case, that possibility alone is chilling. At this point, a critical question must be asked. Why would a mother shape her story so carefully? What is the motive behind revising the timeline, controlling her tone, and deflecting deeper scrutiny? When someone's account keeps shifting, it often isn't because they forgot. It's because they're trying to protect something or someone. Some theorize that Candus may have been covering up an accident that occurred at home. Others suggest there could have been neglect, or even abuse, that spiraled into a situation that needed to be hidden. By keeping the narrative vague, she limits the risk of being caught in a provable lie, because no part of her story ever remains fixed long enough to check against hard evidence. It becomes a moving target, intentionally hard to pin down. Another possibility is image control, shaping the story to avoid public outrage, keeping sympathy on the family, and steering suspicion toward the idea of a mysterious kidnapper. After all, if the public believes she was only gone for 2 minutes, it paints Candus as a responsible mother victimized by circumstances. But if that timeline stretches, and the story keeps changing, the mother begins to look less like a victim, and more like an unreliable narrator. The more we analyze this confession, the more it feels like a construction, a shield, a carefully curated performance. Not because the truth is unclear, but because the truth might be far more damaging than a stranger abduction scenario. And in that possibility lies a darker motive, not just to control the narrative, but to bury it. And this is where we turn it over to you, because sometimes the truth is revealed when enough eyes watch the same lies over and over. In this episode, I want you to really listen to Candus's interviews again, not casually, but critically. Pay attention to the pauses, the tone, the way she glances off camera, the timing of her breath when she's remembering certain moments. Watch how her story starts quickly, but begins to stumble the moment she's asked to recall specifics. If this case bothers you even half as much as it does us, I challenge you drop timestamps in the comments. Tell me where you first noticed the switch in tone. Point out which sentence made you feel like she was performing instead of remembering. Because when hundreds of us start comparing notes, patterns emerge, things even investigators might have missed. Was there a moment where her voice suddenly softened? A moment her eyes shifted when she spoke about Summer going into the basement? Did she pause longer when recalling how long Summer was gone? Those aren't just random quirks, those are tells. This is not about accusing blindly. This is about confronting inconsistencies that have gone unchecked. And if it turns out her confession was carefully crafted, the collective voice of the public might be the only thing strong enough to break it wide open. So I want you, the viewer, to keep watching with a critical eye, because sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins when ordinary people refuse to accept a story that doesn't add up. As we close this chapter tonight, let's bring everything into sharp focus. The emotional disconnect, the shifting timeline, the contradictions in her testimony, the implausibility of a clean abduction in that setting, and the growing public unease that none of this feels real. When you align all those pieces side by side, a disturbing picture starts to form, not of an unsolved disappearance, but of a mother carefully managing a story that may be falling apart. Because confessions are supposed to clarify, they are supposed to bring us closer to the truth. But in this case, Candus Wells's confession seems to do the opposite. It fragments the truth, distorts it, and hides it beneath rehearsed calm and half-finished thoughts. And that leads us to a darker question. If the mother's account can't stand on its own, then what actually happened before Summer Wells vanished? In our next episode, we're going to go even deeper. We'll take Candus's own words and line them up against official law enforcement timelines, the statements from her other children, and even those startling moments in her Dr. Phil appearance that had experts raising eyebrows across America. Because when someone tells a lie long enough, details leak, and that's where the truth usually lives, in the gaps. This isn't about blame, it's about accountability. Summer Wells deserves more than a story. She deserves truth, justice, and resolution. And if the mother's confession was built on lies, then exposing those lies might be the only way to finally find her. Until then, keep asking hard questions, keep examining every word, and don't forget, sometimes the most dangerous place for the truth is inside the story of the person who claims to know it best. This is Detective Max, and if you made it this far, it means you don't just watch true crime, you believe in justice. If you're ready to stand until the truth is exposed, if you believe that no lie should go unchallenged, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because on this channel, we don't stop until every stone is turned, every contradiction exposed, and every guilty heart brought to light. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has reached. How many people around the world are willing to sacrifice their time, their energy, their voice, just to make sure justice prevails for the innocent? Tell me your city, your country, and your thoughts on Candus's lies. Do you believe her story, or do you believe there's something much darker being hidden? Let me know below, because the more of us speak out, the louder this truth will echo. And remember, we don't just tell stories here, we fight for the ones who can't fight for themselves. I'll see you in the next investigation. Detective Max, signing out.